Hello everybody, welcome. Going out for a walk this evening underneath the very nearly full moon. From what I've been able to understand, we moderns are a little bit peculiar in terms of our devotion to exactitude. And that topic turns out to be useful tonight, since it's my intention to discuss problems with abstraction and abstract knowledge and abstract thinking. I think this is harmonious with many of my previous videos, recent videos. Although in many of those videos, I was discussing problems with the intellect. Most of those problems arise when we take the derivations of intellect to be authoritative. I have a little forest of concerns, and it's a little bit windy this evening. So, because I'd like to make a video tonight, I'm going to risk a little bit of wind noise and possibly some hood noise, since my mic is inside my hood. Earlier today, I was listening to a podcast on the Mandukya Upanishad. I can't recall the name of the Swami who was lecturing, but I find his lectures enjoyable and intelligent and enlightening. And I think that if he and I got to have some conversations, it would be a lot of fun. And we could learn a lot together. But it's also fun to just listen to him. In the city where I am at the moment, there's a lot of events per moment going on. Particularly when I'm on a busy street, as I am now. Though even on a busy street, there are intervals of calm. I often notice, living in the city, particularly if I'm in my room, that the pace of noise undergoes transformations throughout the day, increasing and departing, a bit like waves on the ocean. But I've also noticed that throughout the day, if one's awareness is keen, it becomes apparent that there are little spans of something approaching silence. And silence is extremely important for us, for our health and well-being, in the same way that darkness is extremely important for our health and well-being. And for we who live in cities, these are extremely rare. Far less common now that where I live, LED streetlights have been introduced. And they are terrifyingly bright. Which is something I find both oppressive and intrusive and uncomfortable. A more significant problem with many of these lights is they produce a very disturbing kind of shadow as they shine through the lights of trees onto the sidewalk. It's a sort of a digitized shadow. And instead of producing a single shadow, like the lights that I'm used to, produces multiple versions of the same shadow in a pattern I also find quite disturbing. I'm walking up some hills, so I'm going to be huffing and puffing a bit. All of us have various concerns with what is done and not done in our societies, what is taken into consideration or ignored. And in the street lamp problem, a lot of important things were ignored. And many other important things weren't taken into consideration. But when we ask who did the ignoring, we face a more complicated problem, because the who in this question isn't a who at all. It's an abstraction. There wasn't a person really involved in making these decisions, though humans proposed and planned, analyzed, and paid for them. What's making these decisions isn't a being. It's something that more closely resembles a demon or a daemon process. And as I've discussed in recent recordings, what we think of as our societies are really just a tangled mess of largely antiquated, bizarre, opportunistic, and ignorant processes. And some people think when they say the word the government, they seem to think they're referring to people. And certainly the government is peopled by humans. But the processes that drive those humans aren't human. And the structure within which those people function is not only inhuman and dehumanizing, it's aggressively malignant. We live in a world where brighter is better, and that's dangerous for animals and organisms like us, because certain kinds of light harm us, and some of those kinds of light harm us severely. And some of the things we do with light, using a universal we here, it's not real, some of the things that are done by our societies and their subfunctions with light are terrifyingly wrong and represent severe injustices. I'm a person who enjoys walking in darkness. And when one walks in darkness, over a period of about 20 minutes, our eyes adjust. And so the precedence in our vision switches from the foveal to the peripheral. And unless it's entirely pitch black, we can see. Not as good as an owl or a cat, or perhaps a mouse or a bat, but what is meant by vision in bats is a rather complicated thing. But another machine that's undergone a similar transformation relatively recently is the automobile. And the lights on automobiles these days are terrifically blinding to anyone they're shining on, including drivers in the other lane. This makes it both dangerous and painful for people who are older, whose vision is more severely affected by that brightness, and who are more easily blinded. But there's a different kind of vision problem. A vision problem in our thinking, where the extreme apparent brightness of abstractions overwhelms the intelligences that might otherwise be informed by them, replacing insight with ignorance, understanding with declarations, and knowledge with abstractions. Now, whatever is meant by knowledge must be a very complex thing, and so it is true with seeing and intelligence. And each of these simple words that I've chosen to use as pointers towards something. And it would be didactic if I were to too carefully define them. Nonetheless, it falls on me to take some time and shed the light of understanding on some of these terms. Each of which I think of as having many features and changing, the meaning of which change under different circumstances and in different conversations or listeners or people. The onset of the human capacity to introduce to awareness probabilistic thought, statistical thought. Like many of our modern quote-unquote accomplishments, brought with it an unexpected zoo of monsters. In science, for example, there's a principle that's often referred to as objectivity. Often this comes down to a rather clumsy mode of materialist ontology and epistemology. Ontology being the philosophical concern with identity, what things are, and epistemology being the philosophical concern with how we know what things are, or how we know other things, and whether or not our knowledge is justified, true, etc. And as these features were introduced to human cognition, and of course they're not brand new. Humans have probably been doing something that we refer to as playing games of chance for thousands of years. But it was long after the introduction of such games that the capacity to think about them systematically arose. With the onset of mathematical advancement, and particularly statistical and probabilistic analysis. Before I go a lot further, I'm going to mention where the talk you're hearing now got started. In a conversation a few nights ago with a friend, I realized that in our modern electronic interactions and elsewhere in our lives, interactions with news, medicine, all kinds of places, there's a demon behind the curtain. And it's a probabilistic demon. It's a demon of abstractions. Personally, I'm not particularly mathematically advanced, though I have some intuitive knowledge of mathematics, statistics, and probability. The demon behind the curtain is a reductionist formula that does away with context in thinking about identity, situations, circumstances, relationships, and so on. One of my friends on Facebook posed this sort of question. Suppose that you had entered into a relationship with someone with whom you fell in love. And later, it became apparent to you that this person was a devout Christian. Would you continue the relationship? On the surface, at first glance, this seems a reasonable question, unless we think about actual relationships, which have nearly nothing to do with such an abstract question, because there's no such thing as a person. A person is an abstraction of possible, actual people. It is formally impossible to fall in love with a person, particularly the person in this question, This is a non-existent entity. And that's fundamentally important to recognize and understand. Otherwise, our thinking lands first on a foot that doesn't exist. And how then shall we walk? Especially if we expect to continue walking on feet there are no such feet of. When I heard this question, it passed my Verity Sentinel without any ordinary objection, though something of my hackles got raised subconsciously, or maybe even slightly consciously. But I didn't recognize the problem until days later. Sometimes a situation plants a seed in us, and it takes time for that seed to sprout into something we can work with in consciousness. The other abstraction in that question, the two primary abstractions are, suppose you fell in love with a person is one of them. And the second one is, then you discovered they were Christian. Now, the question is framed so that the abstractions take the center stage, and we are tricked into believing that somehow, without any context at all, we know what these abstractions mean. This is impossible. We may know abstractly what they refer to, but no one has abstract experience. No one. Nor does anyone have probabilistic experience. So, the reductionist materialists, those people who would say, for example, only that which is solid and material can be said to meaningfully exist, will then lead us in the direction of our minds don't exist because they are not material objects. Now, fascinatingly, that becomes a paradox very quickly, because if minds don't exist, there's nothing to entertain reductionist concerns or materialist concerns. And if there is nothing to entertain those concerns dissolve and are empty. And there are apologists who will say things like, oh, your consciousness is just a mechanical product of the function of your brain, which is insane, because your brain is not the only organ in your body, and your mind, a much more epiphanous referent, is a very complex thing, including the history of the development of human cognition and every interaction you've ever had with the world or humans or ideas or language, news, adventures, misadventures, and so on. So one of their arguments, the eliminative materialist arguments, and by eliminative we mean do away with everything that cannot be objectively grasped by machines or math, which includes things like minds, souls, consciousness, and so on. So they will say things like, what you think of as your mind is just a trick that's being played on you by the machinery of your brain. The first problem there is that there's no machinery in the brain. They are transferring a metaphor from human technological development into biology, and that's a catastrophic error. Now, even if they took that word out and said the biology of your brain, we'd still be in impossible terrain, because no one has a complete grasp on biology or even knows really what neurons are. There's an ontological problem, or what they are actually doing. Neuroscience has only existed for maybe 75 to 100 years at most. We're talking a single human lifetime. We are at best in preschool and have not even achieved kindergarten here yet. Yet the great hubris of the left hemispheric-like fascination with abstractions would have us believe otherwise, that we've got a grasp on this thing. But how do you get a grasp on that which you get a grasp with? There are a few champions in this field. Iain McGilchrist, the author of The Master and His Emissary, and more recently, The Matter with Things. Both these books have important subtitles. Is a shining star in that constellation, and one I recommend highly to anyone concerned with such matters. And it's not merely a matter of right hemisphere, left hemisphere. It never was. This is a clumsy way of talking about a divide in our interiority that's extremely sophisticated and in which both hemispheres participate ordinarily, though there are circumstances where they do not, such as the Wada test, where one of the hemispheres is anesthetized so that we can effectively ask questions and do tests to see what a lone hemisphere is up to. Another situation in which this is possible is that of a commissurotomy, where the corpus callosum that both connects and disconnects our superficial brain hemispheres is severed, in order generally to prevent seizures of various kinds, which turn out in this case to be a problem with feedback between the two hemispheres. Certain kinds of activation in hemisphere A produce echoing activations in hemisphere B. This quickly becomes a rampant process, and epilepsy, attacks and fits of epilepsy result. And there are less severe kinds of seizure. Perhaps ticking is one of them. Tourette's, maybe having a minor form of seizure of a specific kind. In any case, to return to the crux of my question, there are no abstract people, nor are there abstract Christians. Each person is an actual person, and in an actual relationship, this question resolves itself in a much more complex way than the abstraction of it can. Now, some people sort of caught on in responding to this question and said something like, well, it would depend on the person, or the woman, or the man, or whatever. But in fact, the question is fundamentally deceptive, for it leads us to believe that we know the answer, or can tell the answer, when the scope of that answer, decontexted by any actual relationship, that's what gets done away with in that question. An actual relationship, an actual people. I'll say actual 10 more times really quick. Someone who professes or enacts Christian or Christian-like belief systems, and so on. And many of the questions that we face in daily life are like this. There's some kind of weird hypothetical question about a person who has a railroad switch in their hand, and they have to choose between certainly killing one person or possibly killing 3 people. These questions are hypothetical, but none of our experience is hypothetical, except in thinking. And when we think in abstractions, or if we think in language, we're in great danger of having dismissed 99% of what makes us human. Maybe my numbers are wrong there. Most of what makes us human, and most of what gives value to our subjectivity. The idea of objectivity itself is an abstraction. There are precisely 0 objective observers. We certainly cannot be objective observers. That does not mean that we cannot depart extreme subjectivity in the direction of objectivity. We can do so. And science takes its fundamental value from that behavior. Now, I don't want people to get confused and think Darren's taking a dump on science. That's not my intention here. Science is valuable, although again, these are extreme generalizations here. Which science? What research? Which researchers? What is done with the research? When I use the word science, I'm committing an abstraction, a vast generalization. And while I wouldn't do away with science or scientific thought or behavior, I would ask us to pause at the threshold of enacting it and realize the terrifying danger of equipping societies as malignant as ours with the produce and technologies that emerge from scientific pursuit. I think that's fundamentally morally wrong. It's also a betrayal of intelligence. Because what we will get in almost every case where humans try to solve a problem with technology is worse problems that were not considered when the technology was enacted, like the LED lights. More brightness seems good, more abstraction seems good to something, but not to me. Now, of course, there are domains of concern where objectivity, meaning moving in that direction, and scientific discovery are important and liberating. However, if we have not developed societies capable of enacting these technologies survivably, not just for us, but life on Earth, the history and future of it, for all beings, then we're in an apocalyptic scale crisis, which, of course, the humans of today find ourselves in. So I was thinking about how dating apps ask us abstract questions often, not all of them, most of them. And we answer these questions relatively naively. And then other people read these answers and questions and think they've learned something about us, but they haven't. Because we are not the answers to these questions, and we are certainly not the abstractions that emerge from the questions and their answers, nor do we in any way resemble them. If I have fallen in love with someone, the putative fact of their professed faith will be interpreted by my love, not my capacity to entertain abstractions. The relationship is the fundamental aspect of the situation, not the fact that it is a person I have fallen in love with, or that this person professes specific religious beliefs. So this was the genesis of my concern. Maybe a little wind noise here. My apologies for that. Sort of unavoidable out on a night walk in San Francisco under the beautiful moon, which I think though some moderns are calling it the worm moon for reasons I have not explored, is probably the duck moon or possibly the frog moon in Blackfoot phonology, though I cannot at the moment remember the complexly multi-syllabled Blackfoot names for these moons. I can almost remember them. So Atzakitsum, Bupikitsum, these are probably, the first one's close, the second one's probably far off. Obviously the fragment or phoneme som means moon here. Yet it's less likely that it means the physical object. This is not really its referent. Its referent is the consort of the sun, the being who is the moon, not the object. And this is the difference between language that places precedence on beings and relationships and language that places precedence on objects and abstractions. Earlier, when I spoke of exactitude, what I was going to say was that we moderns, with our scientific methods and our mathematics, have determined precisely the minute of which day the moon is truly full. This is extremely abstract. For indigenous peoples, and each of them have their own traditions and ways of knowing and such, the full moon is usually a period of 2 to 5 days, perhaps most often 3. They're not concerned with which minute the moon is at exact fullness. They're concerned with the relationship and its transformations in living, not mechanical time. Just taking a moment to pause with the actual moon, appearing as it does to me at the moment between the ruling of what we call telephone wires. In between those rulings, I can almost see the movement of the moon because I have something against which to measure that movement. Whereas in the free and open sky, that's a very difficult, if not nearly impossible, task. And in a way, this is metaphorically powerful and ironic, given the context and the topic that I'm entertaining. Because it is the capacity to measure things that tends to produce abstractions. One of the most monumental of which is money. Money is an abstraction of value. value where? What's the context? Well, money is decontexted value. Where value is native to relationships, not abstractions. So money creates a fake veneer that is extremely useful to the daimons of our societies and their institutions, and painfully inhibitive and eviscerating for just about everything else. Now I am coming to the big hill of my walk. So there will be more huffing and puffing. So let's talk a little bit about statistics and probabilities. And I'm not an expert on either of these topics. Most of my knowledge, again, could be classified as naive. Yet I understand the principles well enough to speak about them with some degree of understanding. Statistics have to do with taking measurements over collections of data. And for statistics that have to do with humans, these collections are populations. If the population that is examined is very small, the relative dependability of the statistics shrinks similarly. So that with a cohort of 5 to 100 people, you get statistics that are nearly useless. With a population of 1 million people or 100,000 people, you begin to get statistics that have some degree of relevance to the object of concern, whatever that may be. The important point here is that statistics are abstractions of probability over cohorts. That is essentially a kind of a fraction, right? We found this probability of this event in a cohort of X size. Science relies fundamentally, particularly medical science, on this kind of statistical and probabilistic analysis. Yet again, each human and each actual situation has infinite factors of novelty involved. So, at the level of populations, the statistics look reliable. And in fact, that kind of abstraction is relatively reliable. And the word relatively here refers to the size of the cohort examined. But as we shrink that cohort down from 1 million or 100,000 people to 100 or 50, hearing a frog chorus. And remember I said, this is either the duck moon or the frog moon. Primarily depends on, in Blackfoot phenology, in which moon the raptors begin setting up for mating. The frog chorus heard me talking and went silent. Ironic, since it was their song I was referring to. and yet evocative of the truth. For the moment we begin to speak, much of us goes silent. The resources that we have to dedicate to speaking are very expensive. And so it creates a situation where there's less attention available to invest in awareness or sensitivity. Visual sight is very similar to this. Expensive, biometabolically. So often, if we want to be more sensitive, or if we want to think deeply, we may close our eyes. And thus retrieve some of those resources that we can otherwise deploy. This is related to the problem with abstraction. Abstraction and probability and statistics have the goal of producing a form of knowledge that feels authoritative and within its scope of concern, understanding the limitations of such scopes is relatively trustworthy. If we preserve our awareness of the limitations of its scope and of the common fact that in order to achieve this kind of knowledge, we have to do away with most of context. We may include some bits, right? If we're studying heart failure in populations, we can include features of what we call lifestyle. Do people exercise? Do they sleep well? Do they smoke or drink? Are they obese or diabetic? So forth. We can put little pieces of context in there to help the accuracy of our predictive capacities or our probabilistic models. But largely, abstractions do away with context. And context is the very stuff of actual specific, always specific, human experience in existence. So, we should be wary of the disposal of context that's not merely common to abstraction, but is the fundamental feature of abstraction. There are no probabilistic humans. There's no such thing as a person or a Christian, except in language. Of course, the question that was posed hinges on one's evaluation of a depersonated, generalized idea, the idea of Christianity. And it leverages, or attempts to leverage, the aspect of human minds and thinking that is more attached to abstractions than it is to actual experience or circumstance or human beings or relationships. And that's a con game, a very expensive con game. Because what gets disposed of with context is any possibility of us approaching anything like intelligence or awareness or understanding. When you throw away the context, you're now in a hypothetical universe. There are no such universes, except in models and language. And those aren't universes, they're abstractions. Descriptions, explanations, models. Now, humans have made great spectacle of the functional value of statistics and probability. Unfortunately, what we've done with most of that potential is invested in killing things, including our own minds, our bodies, the world, life on Earth, the history and future of life on Earth. Most of our machines kill the world 24/7. And the vast majority of them profoundly and deeply alter our capacity for physical, emotional, relational, and biological health. That doesn't look like much of a benefit to me at all. And some people would make relatively facile arguments that, well, we've eliminated polio. What about that? Not bad. Probably not bad. Unless we do all of the accounting. And most of the value that we believe, or we are trained to believe by our cultures and their biases, that has been derived from mathematical and probabilistic development or accomplishment. If we do even a reasonably broad accounting of the repercussions, we find that none of the conveniences or accomplishments were economical in the sense of what we had to sacrifice to get to them. What we had to sacrifice, or what had to be sacrificed to the idols of our scientific and technological hubris. And by our, I simply mean human. Again, a broad abstraction, for which I will apologize and which I will acknowledge. There are probably some modestly reasonable uses of this kind of we, the we of all humans, or the we of those humans that live on Earth now. But we are not the ones who enacted all of this stuff. What enacted them were processes that we spawned that quickly acquired dominance over our thought, expectation, culture, bodies, environments. These processes ran rampant and continue to do so, not merely over humankind, but over the entire family of life on Earth, and its history, and its future. Some people will think, well, you can't damage history, it already happened. Yes, you can damage history. You can damage history by fucking up the future. If we do something so terrible that all of history is ashamed of us, human and non, then we fucked up history. If humans obliterate the living environment, the biosphere, or the atmosphere, then we fucked up history. Because we've determined by our actions that that is what history becomes. Similarly, if we do something so incredibly beautiful that every life form on Earth, or even many of them, would be would feel celebratory about the change we've effected. Our ancestors would be ecstatic. The forests and oceans and mountains would be cheering in their roots. Then again, we have changed history because we had a causal role in that history leading to something beautiful and worthy not only of our humanity, but our organismal nature and our shared environment with all beings and all of life on earth, historical and futurial. So I'm asking in my talk tonight that we become aware when we or others or machines or anyone starts to speak abstractly about things that are fundamentally meaningful, like relationships. That we spawn a little process that watches over the use of language and metaphor and analogy and rhetoric to alert us when context has been disposed of, so that we can pause at that precipice and in our minds reintroduce context and become aware of the staggering limitations of the useful or appropriate scope of such activity, and thus preserve the precedence of all that was not there included when faced with a gambit like this. Preserving the precedence of the unknown, of the relational, of the subjective, the experiential, the somatic, the biological, the organismal, the essential, the primordial, the transcendental, and all of this. And keeping the precedence there while entertaining the abstractions only in those ways that they are actually trustworthy or useful. This is the great medicine that I would like us to develop together and share in and experience the benefits of. More and more, our lives are dominated by abstract processes within the functions and institutions of our societies, our languages, our sciences. And this represents a vastly horrifying and unjustifiable array of amputations and circumcisions. Our children and our forebears are crying out to us from their futures and their graves to amend this terrible cascade of wrongdoing that has become so ordinary to us in our common experience as to seem both expected and trivial. Of course everyone drives cars. Of course your life depends upon money and your capacity to make it. Of course probabilities tell us what things are and do. Of course we should exchange the abstract and the seemingly objective for the personal, the actual, the essential, the primordial. And let's do that faster and in more ways each moment, because, well, that's the direction everything goes. Well, it's not the direction I go. And perhaps you will decide that it's not the direction you will go. And perhaps we can forge a direction worth actually going in together, with and for each other, and the history and future of life on earth and all beings. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.